going to be told the longer
She's gonna be in New York for a while.
it is a lot.
How are you? Yeah, good to see you again. Yeah, you're welcome. We know each other. Yeah, we met at airport. He told me he's We'll be talking. See you hiding in the hallway.
If I can have your attention, please. Welcome. Thank you all very much. My name is Audrey, and I'm an assistant director here at the Student Union. And it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Corey Williamson, who is the associate director at the Memorial Union at Iowa State University, and he's going to present on the role of the union in diversity and inclusivity. Excuse me. So we'll have some time after his presentation for question and answers. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Corey.
Thank you so much. All right, very good. Thanks, Audrey. So first of all, thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to come spend time to hear about my qualifications, if you will, for the executive director of the K-State Student Union. I can't say how excited I am to have an opportunity to be on campus, to come back to campus. I am alum, obviously, obviously, right? But I am alum of Kansas State University. And this is the space, this is the building where I discovered my passion for the work. So it's fairly surreal to be back in this space and to be talking about the executive director of the K-State Student Union, and I'm being considered for that. So I am very humbled at the opportunity. And so I do look forward to hearing some of your questions as I go through this presentation. So thank you very much. So I was given several options of what I could present on. One of the options was along the lines of how do we support the institutional goal for student success? And I was also potentially had the opportunity to talk about the future of the union field overall. And the third option is the option that I decided to move forward with, which is what is the role of the student union in supporting diversity and inclusion efforts on campus? And there's a few reasons why I felt like that topic was most applicable. First of all, I feel like diversity and inclusion in this topic really captures the first two questions as it relates to what does the future look like. The future looks like a more inclusive space for all backgrounds and all identities, and particularly in the student union. And then secondly, I also believe that as it relates to my experiences and my experience as a student here, I have a personal connection to this topic. This is, once again, where I started my academic career and in many ways my professional career. And I was telling someone earlier that I really didn't even realize or come to the realization of how important the union, the role that the union played in my development, not only as a graduate student, but also as an undergraduate. And I think so many of our students do have that experience on campus where they take for granted the services and the programs that are offered in this space and the staff that ultimately provides those programs. And so I feel like really talking about diversity and inclusion and being more intentional in the student union is something that's going to propel the institution forward. So I want to lay some foundation here through this video. I have a video from YouTube, and this is always the fun part of the presentation when you have to transition. So if you can bear with me for just a moment. Success, all right.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So this is an interactive portion of the presentation here, but does anyone have any idea how this video connects with the concept of diversity and inclusion, particularly when it is relating to the student union? Yes.
This is a place where connection occurs.
That's good. Which, by the way, there is no wrong answer, so please, you can feel free to provide any feedback you would like. And to be totally transparent, I didn't see it the first time either. I mean, I watched it, and I've seen this video on multiple occasions. Has anyone else seen this video before? Oh, okay, very good. This is new. That's good. But I've seen this video on multiple occasions, and when I looked at it again, I really didn't see the connection between the topic that I wanted to talk about today and what we were talking about there. But I think you hit on a very good point. One of the highlights there is connection, right? This is the place where our students, our faculty and staff, and they come and they connect and they come to find connection, whether it's a conscious decision or whether it's an unconscious decision. The other thing is what just stood out to me even in watching it this moment, how many times do our students hear, at least you got here, right? At least you're on campus. Everything else, you may be experiencing, you just got to work through it because you're here and you need to take advantage of the opportunity. And there may be some truth to that statement, but ultimately, that's coming from a different perspective or a different lens than I think we need to be coming from if we're going to be successful in moving this conversation forward or moving our actions forward. And so I'll give you another quick example. Recently, I just attended the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. Now, it was my first experience, and quite frankly, it was a phenomenal experience. Now, just to give you a little bit of insight on how I found out about the conference, Iowa State has been sending a delegation to the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity for the past 20 years. And I give Dr. Tom Hill a lot of credit for that, who was the former VP of Student Affairs. He's the one that brought it to campus and ultimately nurtured it to the place that it is now. So this year we had 81 delegates go to the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. And we're so committed as an institution at this point to where it has its own dedicated office to continue to keep the work going forward. And so with that, though, this was my first time having an opportunity, and I went with some of my colleagues from work. And so, one, I found the experience to be very enlightening. It was very refreshing. I had not been to a conference like that, because usually you go to a professional development experience, and what you want to do is you want to pick up some tools, put them in your tool bag, come back, and figure out how you can implement them. And quite frankly, I think all of us that went to the conference expected to do just that. Go to the conference. Matter of fact, one of my colleagues said, let's take our mission statement and our strategic plan, and we're going to look at our strategic plan from the lens of race and ethnicity, and let's see what we can implement. And so as we were attending sessions, my colleagues, who all happen to be Caucasian or white, or identify as white, the conversation in between is, man, that was a really good session. How do we apply it? Man, that's a really good session. But how? And it kept coming back over and over again. And eventually, I did respond and I said, well, I think the challenge with applying change is at first there has to be some self-reflection. You have to do some self-evaluation and identify, and I think the video even made a statement around identify something within yourself that can connect with the experience that other individual is having. And that's not minimizing that other person's experience. As a matter of fact, it's you stepping outside of yourself in many ways to make that connection. And so I had that conversation around self-evaluation, and I think it's still going to take some time to kind of figure out, okay, how do we translate an experience like that to application on campus? But ultimately, as student union professionals, that's exactly what we need to do if we're going to continue to support and help this conversation going forward. So my focus today is really going to be around the fabric of what it means to be in the union field, what it means to work at the K-State Student Union, and ultimately some principles that we can apply or some concepts or practical things that we can apply to move the needle forward. So I'll transition back just a moment. And I have support if I need it correct, but I think we should be fine. All right. So I wanted to start off with the pillars of success, of student success, that have been identified by Kansas State University. In reference to I believe we're in the process of looking at our enrollment management plan, and we've identified these pillars. And I do believe the union does have some connection to all of these pillars, but as you can see, I highlighted in purple, the area where I think we can have the most impact, right? So we're obviously going to support and partner with the academic side of the campus. Financial capabilities, this is where students do utilize their resources, and we can figure out ways to support students in that way. And then I do believe there's some overlap potentially in the sense of well-being and wellness, the sense of belonging and wellness. But ultimately, I think the K-State Student Union is where students will be able to come and have that sense or create that sense or engage that sense of belonging on campus. So starting off, though, I did kind of want to address the idea of the role of the college union. Because once again, as you start talking about diversity and inclusion, I think the temptation is to think, well, that's the chief diversity officer's role, right? That's the multicultural student affairs role, at least at other institutions. Maybe it's a little different here. But as it relates to the union, it's very much so built into the fabric of what it means to be a union. So this is the role of the college union that has been adopted by the Association of College Unions International. So this is directly from their website. And I'll just read the highlights here. Advances a sense of community, unifying the institution by embracing the diversity of students, faculty, staff, alumni, and guests. And then I'll jump down to, we deliver an array of cultural, educational, recreational programs, services, and facilities. So that is the work that we do. This is what we have signed up for if we're going to be in the union profession. And then if I'm going to drill down even more specifically to the mission of the K-State Student Union, we have identified that through facility services, programs, leadership experiences, we will foster a diverse community. Now, one might say, well, I don't see the word inclusion in there, but I don't think you can really have community without the concept of inclusion. So I do believe inclusion is very much so built into the fabric of even who we are as a K-State Student Union. And please, if for those, I do still consider myself a part of the K-State family, and so I will be utilizing the terminology we, regardless of how the process moves forward. Which, by the way, I will take them off script just for a second. And I do want to just say how much I do appreciate the current team and the current staff, particularly Bill, back in the back there, in his leadership and what the team has been able to foster and create in our union. And so even as a alum of the institution, I came back and had such a great sense of pride for the work that you all are doing and that you all continue to do. So back on script, opportunities. So I've identified 5 opportunities to create that sense of inclusion and diversity, or better yet, the sense of belonging on our campus and how we can help support that as a union. So the 5 items that I'm going to talk about is intentional safe space, role modeling of the principles of community, educational programming, community through partnerships, and assessment and planning are the 5 areas that I will focus on. So first and foremost, I think we have an opportunity to create safe space for not just our students. Obviously, our students are our #1 priority, but not just for students, but for all of the campus community. And in order to do that, I think there has to be a sense of ownership. So our students have to come in and acknowledge or recognize that this is their space. This is their home. Today, I received a lot of several questions around how do we get students to re-engage the union at the levels that they were before the renovation. And I think one of the key steps to doing that is reminding students that this is their place. This is their third place. This is their home away from home. And there's a variety of ways that we could do that, and we can strategize around that. One of the ways that I think is very important, which is already implemented here, is through our union governing board. It's important to have that shared governance model to where we allow our students to have not only input, but to feel like they are helping to drive the agenda of what it is that we do as a union. And then we also need to make sure that we have an opportunity for free and respectful expression of ideas. Every one of us kind of need to have that place. For me, when I was here on campus, I had that opportunity and that experience in my place of employment. I worked in the TRIO programs area. And so that was my place where I felt like I was at home, that I felt connected. And I'm not necessarily sure I would have persisted if I didn't feel like there was a place that I had ownership of. And I do believe this is the one location on campus that all of our students can have a stake in the ownership. And so there's some strategies that we can implement, whether it's through marketing strategies or whether it's through how we orientate our students as they're coming in, to make sure that they know that they are that they have a sense of ownership, and that this is a place where they can have free and respectful expression of ideas. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And the space needs to be accessible and visible to the entire community. So right now, obviously some of the things that we've been able to do as far as a building as a whole, I don't think you can come on campus and not recognize the space for the entire community. But even as those that feel as though they don't have a place, I think we need to identify some locations. The Veterans Center is a perfect example of that, where I feel like the Veterans Center was able to identify a space for the students that they serve in a location that they felt safe, they felt comfortable, but it's also visible. So the signage on the third floor, for example, you can't miss it. I mean, not the third floor, the second floor. You can't miss the signage there. Services and resources. It is critical that we provide the services and resources that students need in order to feel that sense of ownership. An example that I would be able to provide is that at my current institution, we do have a multicultural center, and it was a part of a 2008 renovation that was completed. Part of that, though, I'm not sure if the goal of the multicultural center has been fully realized from what we were originally intending to take place versus what it's become. And I think a part of that is that it is a great space. It's a beautiful space. If you haven't been in there, I encourage you to visit. It has a great lounge space. It has a space where students and other folks can meet. It has a library space. It has some reflection space. But I think the challenge that I see with the space is that students, when they walk into it, they don't have a connecting point. They don't have a service or a resource that they can sink their teeth into and feel like it's home. And I think one of the resources that are necessary, for example, for a multicultural space is to have some kind of staff or advising that students can come in and feel like that they can let their hair down and just have a conversation and get some feedback around their experiences. And I also think the space has to ultimately reflect who they are and their identity and their background. So these are a few examples of some safe spaces. We talk about the Multicultural Center, which I know has been a dialogue on campus, and I think you all are making some great progress around at least what that could be and what that could look like and the services that it could provide. And I do think the union as a whole can help support that agenda. Regardless of where it ends up being located, I think the union can help provide some context around how we can help create a space that students will feel like they have a sense of ownership. Reflection and mindfulness space is another great example, something that we've been working on at Iowa State's institution. Right now, we do have reflection space, but they have been kind of repurposed for other uses. And I think and one of the challenges that I see with that is that every now and again, we'll be walking down the stairwell and we'll see a student under a stairwell praying. And I feel so, my heart goes out to those students because I know that that's because we haven't done our role or our job to make sure that they have the space that they need to serve or to acknowledge their religion the way that they need to. Gender inclusive restrooms is another area where I know that's been a topic around the nation, and I think that's something that if we don't already have here at the K-State Student Union, that's something that we can definitely look into and figure out how we can accommodate students. And then the Veteran Center, as I talked about, I think is a success of the K-State Student Union. Ultimately, I believe that if we're not providing these spaces, we're sending an unintentional message that the student doesn't belong here, right? So if I'm going to a space or if I'm on a campus and you don't have the services that I need, it gives me the impression that you didn't even think about what I would need when I get here, and that's something that we definitely don't want to continue to promote. Secondly, I believe we need to role model. And I believe the role modeling starts with our faculty and staff on campus. We need to set the example. And in order to do that, we need to have inclusive human resource practices. And I know we're doing some things well. I actually discovered before I came, one of the recommendations that I would make around inclusive practices is to make sure that we include principles of community in our position descriptions. Well, I got the position description for the executive director, and lo and behold, on page 1, the principles of community were there. So that's a great indicator that we are doing some things well. But then I would also say we need to focus on our PDs, our position descriptions, our job descriptions, but we also want to make sure that as we are recruiting, we're being intentional in our recruiting efforts. And so one of the things that we make sure to do at Iowa State University is that whenever a position is open, we try to make sure that we're intentional around promoting that position in various areas throughout campus and obviously on national boards as we can. But I happen to be the co-chair of the Black Faculty and Staff Association. And one thing is whenever we find out about a position being open, we make sure that we include that in our newsletter as it goes out to campus. Once again, it may not be someone on campus that gets to take advantage of that, but those that are on campus can help share that more broadly. And I know I've taken advantage of that on several of occasions. Also, physically display the principles of community within the space, whether that is in some type of signage of some sort or whether it's on a digital display. But something that, as the freshmen that are coming into orientation, that when they're met here, they met with, this is what it means to be a K-State student, or this is what it means to be a part of the K-State family. And so I think we can help do that because we are actually the touch point when students enter into the Kansas State family, and we're also the touch point as students are leaving the K-State family. So I do believe that's something that's very practical that we could incorporate. Continual development of cultural intelligence and competence for full-time and student staff. And so I'm gonna spend a couple of minutes just talking about what I mean by cultural intelligence, because I was able to attend a training about a year ago at the NACAS conference, the National Associations of College Auxiliaries and Services. And I found it to be very insightful, and I think it's a very tangible approach to helping staff and students become more aware of what it means to be culturally intelligent. Just a second, please. I'll give you time to read the definition here. So cultural intelligence is the capability to function effectively across national, ethnic, and organizational cultures. And so pretty straightforward definition, but as you look at the process of becoming more culturally intelligent, because I do think it's a spectrum. I don't know if you ever become culturally intelligent. I think it's something that you continue to grow and develop over time. But there are there are 4 dimensions around how do you continue to build that competency. First is the drive, the motivation, to have the desire to, the interest, the confidence, and the motivation to adapt cross-culturally. So first of all, you have to want to. So that kind of goes back to my original point of you have to have that self-reflection and posture yourself to be the change that you want to be in the environment that you are in. And so I do believe that that drive is the first step. Secondly, then you begin to attain more knowledge. And so you understand intercultural norms and differences. And so that's a tricky one because yes, you can obviously continue to read and learn, but that also comes in that safe space where you have those dialogues and you're able to have questions or ask questions without the judgment, but also in such a way that you don't feel like the students, for example, don't feel like they have to be the educators all the time when it comes to this topic and this conversation. So that's where the intentional training is very important. So then that way we're all pursuing this information and knowledge on the same path. CQ strategy. Once you have the information, then you need to determine to decide what are you going to do with that information. So making sense of culturally diverse experiences and planning accordingly. Once again, it's that intentionality around how do you implement your ability to transition between cultures and adapt your behaviors accordingly. And then lastly, it is the action of adapting verbal and nonverbal actions appropriately when interacting cross-culturally. So if we can go through these dimensions of development and learning, I do believe that as a union overall, or as this is a potential model that we could use to make sure that all of our staff has not only the empathetic response to the needs of all of our students and all of our faculty and staff, but also that we have a plan in place to continue to build our competency in this area. So a couple of examples of the specific dimensions as it relates to cultural intelligence. For example, one culture may be more focused on punctuality, getting started on time. Another culture may be more focused on relationships or some spectrum in between there. And so sometimes I think if someone's culture doesn't necessarily connect with the culture in which I've been brought up in and how I've grown up, we can be a little judgmental around, okay, so this person is always 10 minutes late. There may be something behind that other than they're not willing to respect you and respect your time and your energy. So punctuality and relationships, communication. Some folks, some cultures are more direct and others are indirect. And when I refer to culture as just kind of as an FYI, culture can go into the realm of ethnicity and background, but it can also be an institutional culture. It can also be a departmental culture. So I would challenge you to think about these in as broad a spectrum as you possibly can. Lifestyle, doing versus being. So the one thing, and I'm being a little vulnerable here, but when I work with my children at home, when I come home from work, I'm thinking, everybody needs to be doing something around here. Somebody needs to be doing some dishes. You need to be cleaning your room. The basement needs to be clean, but everybody needs to be doing something before we play. But that's a cultural expectation. That's the way I was brought up and as a raised, and that's what I'm imparting into my children, as opposed to just being. I had an opportunity to go to Nicaragua last year on a mission trip, which was an amazing experience. And as I was in Nicaragua, one thing I realized is that nothing started on time, and that there wasn't a whole lot of busy activity happening in the area. And for a while, it took me to adjust, because we would intend to have a program start, let's say at 6 p.m., and the program wouldn't start until 8 p.m. And so that's quite different from how we operate in the United States, or better yet, in Iowa, I guess I would say it that way. But once again, I was in a different environment, and I had to adapt in what I expected from those around me. And quite frankly, there was a sense of connection that came from being in a different space that operated in a different way. And then lastly, just another example, achievement versus cooperative, achievement being cooperative versus competitive. Community partnerships. This is the third area that I think we can move the needle on diversity and inclusion. One is to foster relationship with student organizations to identify partnership opportunities. And so as a student union, I think it's important for us to connect with student organizations and identify ways that we can support their initiatives and what it is that they want to accomplish on campus. We had our Black Student Association come to us and say, we're not seeing the events that attract students within our organization. And so instead of just kind of dismissing that concern, we said, why don't you partner with us and let's see what we can do to create a large-scale event. In that case, we were able to get Waka Flocka Flame. I'm not sure. I knew who he was. I hadn't heard his music at the time. But anyway, Waka Flocka Flame was on campus, and they had a very successful opportunity to engage not only their population, but to the rest of the campus population, which turned out to be a great success. Another example would be the Social Justice Summit that is conducted at Iowa State on an annual basis. And that's a collaboration with various departments on campus, as well as with student organizations. And that's an opportunity for almost 100 students to come and just talk about what it means to create a social justice environment and to engage in the social justice dialogue. The other area where I believe the K-State Student Union can continue to build partnership is with the Office of Diversity and the Chief Diversity Office. I think that is a key partnership for our department, and to make sure that, one, we're providing the resources necessary. I think a great example of that was the KSU Unite event. Once again, by the way, I think someone else heard me talk about this, but I feel like that was a very unprecedented approach to the dialogue around inclusion, to shut the entire campus down and say that this is going to be our sole priority for the next 3 or 4 hours. And I think it was actually for the full day. And so the union played a critical role in that by providing the space and making sure that we had a safe space, once again, to be able to bring different thoughts together and continue the dialogue. If I'm offered the opportunity, I would love to be a part of that movement. Educational programming is another area where I feel like we have the resources and the tools to move forward the agenda of diversity and inclusion on campus, and whether that be creating high-impact student experiences through leadership and educational opportunities. Once again, I have to go back to the Union Governing Board as a space where students have a way to have a huge impact on what we do as a union, as well as our student employment program. Our student employee program is one of the areas where we get to touch students directly on a day-to-day basis. And I've only heard amazing things about the students that work here in the union. And so that's another way to influence not only the union, but the broader campus as it relates to diversity and inclusion of who we hire and how we train those students to then interact with our campus population. I would be remiss if I didn't include inclusive art and symbols throughout the union. That's one of the areas where I believe this union does a fantastic job. I think I told someone I got in trouble back at the campus I work at because I came here and I saw all the art on the walls, and I went back and I said, this is what we need to be doing. And I'm not the expert on art, and I was reminded of that when I had that conversation. But nonetheless, but I do believe that it's critical and important, and it's something that has come up on our campus on multiple occasions, that students don't see themselves reflected on campus. And then secondly, it's educational. It allows other students on campus to learn more about other cultures through reflecting those cultures in our symbols and our art. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about assessment and planning, because we can do the work, but if we're not assessing it, and if we're not figuring out if it's successful or if it's impactful, then ultimately we're not utilizing our resources effectively. And so I believe whether it's through focus groups, whether it's through a peer review, whether it's through survey tools, assessment, conversation, observation, all that information needs to be captured and then reviewed to see where we are and are we really having an impact. And then I believe the union governance model will help us remain accountable for the actions and the work that we're doing on campus. And so I believe the combination of collecting information, analyzing that information, and then sharing it broadly will help us continue to make progress in this area of diversity and inclusion. So in summary, I would just like to read this quote, because I think it pulls it all together. Because no matter what, we can do all the actions in the world, but if we're not coming from the right place, it's still not going to be well received or is not going to have the impact that we're looking for. So inclusion is a mindset. It is a way of thinking. It is not a program that we run or a classroom in our school or a favor we do for someone. So it's not handing the sandwich out. Inclusion is who we are. It is what we must strive to be. And so in order to continue to move our institution forward, I believe this is the mindset that we must have in order to make an impact. Are there questions that I can respond to at this point? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I have a question. First of all, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. You mentioned the word safe space several times during the presentation. And as I was listening to your definition or your description of that, I began to think that you think of that not so much as a physical space as much as a mindset. Could you comment on or expand a little bit about what your thinking is of safe space?
Absolutely. I believe it's a combination of the two. So safe space is providing the physical space, because once again, a union without the physical space is a challenge. I know our history is that we actually started, the union field actually started before the building was originally built, but the building actually helps enhance the experience or the space that we're providing. But you're right, providing the building without necessarily providing the environment, I think we're falling significantly short. So we must be intentional around the type of environment, the space, and it goes back to some of the things that I talked about, whether it's the symbols that we provide, the services that we provide. I think all of those really speak to something beyond just a physical space. It really is speaking to the fact that we acknowledge that you are a critical part of our institution. We value what you bring to our institution, and we want to cultivate the family or the community in which we are hoping to move forward. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, there you go. Yes.
So in addition to all of the important work that we do internally on campus, the union is often the front door to the community for our Manhattan residents who may never come to campus except for to come to the student union to take their child to go bowling or to use the facilities for a business event. So how do you intend to continue to foster that relationship with our partners out in the Manhattan community?
Very good. And by the way, that's maybe the third meeting that I've had that question asked, so it's clearly an important part of what we're doing here in the union. And I would say it's similar to what we're doing at Iowa State. I think one of the keystones of the work of the union is building the relationships. And so a couple of things that I've either experienced or seen at my current institution is that it's important for the team as well as the director to get out into the community and have impact and influence. And what I mean by that is joining, let's say, the Ames, we're about to refer to the Ames Convention and Visitors Bureau, but whatever because we have a seat on that that board, and that bridges the connection with Ames. And I think a very parallel approach here will be effective. Similarly, there's what's called a campus town, which is pretty much Aggieville in Ames, Iowa. And there's a Campus Town Action Association. And we make sure to have at least one of our staff members as a part of that association, once again, to be a support. And so what we do is obviously we pay the dues towards that association, but we also help support programs that they put on. So for example, there's a family night that takes place in late summer, early fall. And so we provide some of the resources to that event and to that program to let them know that the union is more than just a part of just the university community, but it's a part of the greater community. And so those are a couple of examples by having presence in the community and continuing to engage and provide support whenever we can. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Could you talk about some of your partnerships in your current position with the international office?
International office. So the international office is actually housed within the Memorial Union. And so we have a very strong relationship and partnership there. We really, obviously, it's the space where they conduct all of their orientations for students. And I won't take any credit for this, but even most recently, our department facilitated a leadership workshop with the international students on campus. And so it was a partnership with the ISSO Office, International Students and Scholars Office, and the Memorial Union, and the work we're doing in leadership in order to kind of help support our international students in a variety of ways. I think the most significant impact we have probably with our international students is really with space. They really are struggling with the space that they have allocated to them. It's just not sufficient. And so as a part of the renovation work that we're going to be doing in the very near future, we just secured $11 million to renovate our former hotel space. We've dedicated essentially an entire floor of our building to our International Students and Scholars Office in order to help them provide the services that they need. Does that answer your question? All right, very good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Corey, I appreciate your remarks, and particularly your comments about Bill and his staff. You're absolutely right in terms of the work that they've done for us. You mentioned several examples, including KSU Unite, in your presentation. Realize that as University we decided on Sunday night that we were going to do it, and it meant volunteering our union to be the focal point for the educational part. That meant this union staff coming together and rescheduling rooms, technology, making sure the building was ready for thousands of students, faculty, and community members came together to celebrate and to improve our university environment. So you're right to bring up KSU Unite. My question deals with freedom of expression. We're going to be faced, as we have in the past, with the idea that we respect the expression of ideas.
Yes.
Sometimes those ideas are repugnant. They go to the very core of everything we disagree with. Give me an example of where you've orchestrated that event, where the union, with your experiences, have had to deal with a speaker or a program or an activity that clearly does not reflect the university values, the culture, but yet you said we respect all ideas and expressions. We have freedom of expression. How do we reconcile that in a real life example?
Great question. That I have. We did have a request, and ultimately we're moving forward with bringing on Milo Yiannopoulos to campus. And obviously it was around the time, I believe it was either right after the election or right before, but it was a very tense time on campus at the moment. And so we received the request, I believe it must have been at least 6 or 7 months in advance of the program. And we got it on the radar of our administration, and we just said, hey, this is coming. There's nothing in our policies or procedures that would prevent this individual from coming. But nonetheless, obviously, we know that there's going to be some attention around this individual coming to campus. We also reached out to the Department of Public Safety, which is our campus police department, and several others to kind of get folks, make sure folks aware of what was coming down the pike. Well, as we got closer to the event, I think it became more and more clear, just because of some of the other events that had happened at other campuses, that this was probably going to be a little bit more of a challenge than I think some folks originally anticipated. And so we brought a team together, and it was a campus-wide team. And ultimately, the president of the university also got involved. But essentially, what came of the event is that as we continue to inform the person that was planning the event of the fees that would be associated with the program, there was a sense that they were being called out for their content as opposed for the nature of our policies. And so it did become somewhat of a media concern in the sense that it did. I don't know if it got national attention, but it definitely got some local attention. But ultimately, we let them know that because of the writer, they requested security for, let's say, 6 or 7 individuals. And so when we let them know the cost of the security, then there was a concern being brought to our attention and saying, you're charging us for the security because you're trying to prohibit our speech. Ultimately, we clarified that there's no, you're not being treated any differently than any other group, which is what's important when we start talking about First Amendment rights. And so ultimately the event did not happen because they were not interested in paying the cost for the security. But at the same time, we had went through all the planning and we had talked about, essentially what would have happened is if the event would have taken place, we would have had the security in place. So we had a plan, we had an emergency response plan, we had a plan for those that would be protesting the event. And so we had all the necessities in place and everyone was positioned, but ultimately the group pulled out because of the cost of the event and the program. And unfortunately, or unfortunately, that's the extent, I believe, of what we can do is adhere to our policies. Another example may be, and it wasn't necessarily a program, but we have had several white nationalist posters posted on our campus. And so we have taken down those posters, but we didn't do it to prohibit free speech. What we did is we did because it actually violated a policy on campus. And so if a student was to post a white nationalist poster on a kind of a board, a free expression board that doesn't have any limitations on how that information can be posted, then that's where it would land, and then we would have to navigate some of the feedback and the response from there. So fortunately for us, I don't think the event did not transpire, but we were up until the week before the event, before the student ultimately, because he wasn't a part of the student organization, so he was coming as a kind of a third party, but the student ultimately pulled the event, and we moved forward from there. So at the time, it was a very highly stressful experience. It was an experience that I was able to grow from, because once again, obviously the president got involved. The president receiving calls from both sides, particularly of donors saying I would not be interested in donating to the campus if you allowed the speaker to speak. And then he was receiving the opposite call of, if you don't allow the speaker to speak, then it's going to impact you foundationally as well. So that's the experience that I had with that particular circumstance. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You spoke about cultural intelligence. I want to ask if you will expand that for a moment. But before I do that, I need to acknowledge how amazing it was that you could take 80 people to the Infor conference.
All right.
It is an expensive conference, well worth the investment. And now I'm motivated to go back and have a different conversation with my team. Next to your we talk here on campus. We've had more than a handful of climate surveys. So I'm wondering how the cultural intelligence framework that you have talked about fits into our ongoing conversations about enhancing and growing and strengthening our climate on our campus. Can you kind of move that conversation in that direction?
Yes, and I would say too, the conversation around cultural intelligence is one of many models. And so I just wanted to provide a tangible model that I'm familiar with and that I've had hands-on experience with that I do believe could be impactful going forward. Whether it's moving the conversation forward or backward, I'll let you determine. But ultimately, I do believe it's a matter of that posture of empathy that we kind of started the conversation with. I think, one, it puts some action to that posture. So to say, let's be empathetic and not have further dialogue, I think would be defeating. But then I would also say on the opposite end, if we have the empathetic posture, but not necessarily the tools in order to apply to the campus, then I think that's also just as defeating. So I do believe it requires both the self-reflection, self-evaluation, and drive and desire to take action on this topic. So it requires that, but then it would have to become somewhat institutional. So as the potential director of the union, I know I would have direct influence in applying that tool to our staff. And so I think for the union itself, I do believe that if we have a team ultimately that is on the same page, because I think sometimes what stops the conversation is the ignorance ultimately. I think sometimes we just don't know how to apply, how to show support, how to have an impact. And I believe that the tool or some tool of that sort would be able to kind of remove that particular barrier, and then we can continue to move forward. If it was to be, and then based off of where we're positioned on campus and what our role is on campus, I do believe that could also have an impact because everyone is being touched by this particular concept, model, or tool, because when we interact with, whether it's a first-time student to campus, they have the initial experience of knowing that they are valued here. And I think that then reduces that sense of, as I started off earlier, if I didn't have the home that I had, I'm not sure if I would have persisted through my education, but I had a home and I had support. I do believe that if we create an organization, whether it's the union or it's the broader institution, that creates that environment where folks feel included, they feel like that their culture is not only acknowledged, but let's say, we continue to gain more knowledge in our cultural intelligence, then the students that are maybe falling through the cracks now may not necessarily fall as far, And so, for example, I will kind of talk about my NCORE experience. Through NCORE, after kind of going through that experience, one of the things that I kind of walked away with was we all know nationally our African American male men are just not persisting at the level that they need to, or that at the same level as their counterparts. And so I walked away from the NCORE experience saying, okay, let's go ahead and implement an opportunity to connect with our African American men as soon as they get on campus. And so I'm in the process of reaching out to orientation. I have another partner on campus that was very much so engaged and wanted to do the work. And so we're working together to put together a forum where African American men can meet at least 2 times a semester and start creating some of those organic relationships so that way they can have a connecting point throughout the time on campus. I mean, if you're a first generation student that has not had the background that has prepared you for this environment, that particular tool itself, or that particular experience of having someone that you can call and say, how do I navigate this? Or I'm having a challenge with my advisor. I've had at least 2 students that I've come across within the last year that have been on campus for 7 to 8 years, unfortunately, and just have not been able to figure out how to graduate. And their reason for that is because of their advising. Well, if we can make that connection during their first year, then we can kind of help them navigate those waters when it comes to what type of information they need, if they're not getting the advising that they need, who to contact, who to work with. And so I think that's kind of a small microcosm of what could happen at a larger scale if we all started taking on the mindset of being empathetic and including our students and trying to support our students in the best way that we possibly can. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Corey, given that this is the first stop on your itinerary, I'm sure that financial constraints have come up at some point in time since you've been on campus. And given that many campus departments are facing financial strain for a number of different reasons, how do you feel like a student union can enhance collaboration and partnerships with campus units, specifically through the space it offers? Knowing that desirable space for meetings and conferences and programming is not plentiful across campus, while also being one of those units that's going through some of the same financial constraints as those units that's asking for space to utilize.
Very good. The model here is a little different than the model that I have at Iowa State University, and so I want to be careful of how I approach that conversation, because it's very much so contingent on how your finances are built and what your funding sources and your funding model is. And so maybe I can speak a little bit to the Iowa State experience without indicating that that would work here, if that's okay. And so the way that our funding works at Iowa State University is that it's a kind of a shared funding or financial model where we do receive general fund dollars, because that's how we refer to it. So it's not a student fee, but for our operations, we receive general fund dollars. And those general fund dollars are ultimately there to support the use of campus, the campus use of the Memorial Union. And so with that, student organizations and departments have free access to the building, with the exception of maybe some of the services such as IT or audiovisual or staffing. You know, there is a cost for some of those services, but because of how our funding model is set up, the space is open and available to the campus body. Now, mind you, that's a model that's supported centrally, and so that's how that works there. I would obviously have to look at how we're set up here and how we could create more opportunities for access to space without having a substantial burden on the departments throughout campus. Other questions? I'm gonna take that as a compliment. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. I'll be here for as long as you need me. If you have any other questions, just let me know. But once again, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come see this presentation.